All right, all right. So I'm excited. I get to talk with Dave here for 20, 30 minutes, and I get to ask questions that you wish that you could sit down and ask him. And the focus today will be on church planting. Dave is going to tell you a little bit about himself here in a minute, but he's the co-founder of Exponential. He is a pastor and has been for 30 plus years, if I recall correctly. And then NewThing is another initiative that he's running on the side, and so he's wearing all these different hats, and not to mention husband and father. But there's just so much that he's doing as someone who has worked in churches, who has helped plant a church, who's been in this space for a long time now. I'm excited to sit down and pick his brain. Dave, thank you. Faith Life thanks you. Logos thanks you for being here and taking the time to talk with us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jason, and thanks for asking me to talk about my favorite topic.
Absolutely. I feel like I sent you a few talking points, and then I was like, I don't think you're going to need much prep. I think the stuff we're going to talk about is what is the reason you do what you do, honestly. So it should be pretty fun. I think it'll be a good conversation. Anyone who's watching right now, please take a moment and hit the share button. If like church planting will resonate with your audience, your friends and your family on social media. And also this whole time while we're having our live conversation, if there's something that you'd like to learn more about or a topic that you'd like to sit on, I would like for us to sit on and explain a little bit more, know that we're watching the comments right now. I just double checked. We're live everywhere. So this is exciting. We're live on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And we will happily pause on our conversation and address your questions if you've got any. So that's exciting. Dave, for those who don't know you, a little bit more about you, about what I just said. I know that you're a father. I know that you're a husband, and I know that you're doing all these big things. So could you tell me and everybody who's watching live right now a little bit more about you?
I think you covered most of it. Yeah, I have three children, and they're not really children because they're adults now. My daughter Amy, who lives in the city, and when I say the city, I mean Chicago, and she's a social worker. Yep, and I have my middle son Josh, who my wife and him and I just did a 9-hour U-Haul trip from his former location of Cincinnati to DC, and we still like each other. If you can imagine, all three of us sitting in front of the U-Haul to get him set up out there in a new job. And son just finished up his MBA, and he's interviewing for a job tomorrow. So that's the stuff at home. And then, I pastor a church. I lead NewThing. We plant churches all over, and then also I'm the co-founder and interim CEO for Exponential.
Absolutely. And you didn't even mention all the books that you've published or worked on, including some resources with us in some of the courses that we have. And so there's that side of things too. You just casually write a few books on the side of everything that you're doing. So yeah, I'm absolutely impressed. And like I said at the front end, I'm just excited and honored to like spend this time and get to talk to you, pick your brain about all that you do. Can I ask a candid question, I guess, is how do you juggle all of that? Like you are doing so many different things, including trying to manage a 9-hour drive from Cincinnati to Chicago. So how do you do that and keep peace and keep everything as balanced as it can be?
Well, first of all, Jason, your assumption that I'm doing it well might be called into question. I mean, truthfully right now, because I mean, literally, I'm in the basement of my house. I was just upstairs to my wife, and I was just telling her, oh man, I need to take a nap.
Yeah.
Because I have a lot of energy and I am entrepreneurial, but probably the number of things I got going on right now, I'll be able to sustain that for, a few more months. But because like I said, I'm the interim CEO. I love my role with Exponential. I was a co-design the theme. I get to kind of be an upfront presence for it and challenge people. But the operational piece that I'm doing right now, I love our team, but it's not something I'm going to be able to do long term. But there are some things, and if you wanted to get into them, I mean, that I try to do on a regular basis. I call it checking my RPMS. And there's a daily thing that I do to say, okay, how much am I drifting, away from who I want to be? And that's not a cure for everything, but it helps me tell the truth about what's going on in my life.
Yeah. Yeah, I would love to get into that. I'm familiar with what you're talking about already, and I would love to get into that, especially when we talk about leadership and church planting and how to juggle all of that at the same time. So I think that
Let's do it.
to set the stage a little bit today, we'll be talking about Dave's story and what led him to Exponential, and then what in the world Exponential is for those who are not familiar with it. I'd love to camp out on the pulse of church planting and like in that whole space. You've got of you have so much knowledge and experience in that space that I think that you could share a lot with me and then with some of the leaders here. And then encouragement is really what I want to bring it home. This at the end of our time together is what in the world from your time, your experiences, any stories from scripture that you think would be helpful, or any stories from other church plants that you could share to encourage those folks who are listening in live. But something I want to make sure that I share it at the front end is in September, there's a little bit, this could go a couple different ways. We've got a webinar coming up in September. The focus will really be on here. I made sure that the link is in the comments there. Equipping and mobilizing church for evangelism in the digital age. But as we were talking and setting things up, Dave, you said there may be something more involved in that webinar. What is that?
Well, it could go one of two ways, because I am a new user of Logos Bible software, so it might be a webinar of come and watch Dave learn how to use Logos, which will be amusing.
Yeah.
Or the other thing, it might be, hey, come and hear about how to use the Blessed Practices, which is my most recent book, and it's all about kind of evangelism and kind of a post-Christian, post-modern age in a digital context. So we could go either way. We'll find out between now and September.
I think we'll make sure we make time for both, because I think if nothing else, the Logos learning and training may be like outtakes or something. Who knows? I don't know. Anybody who, I mean, it can be difficult to get onboarded sometimes, but yeah, there's help. So anyways, so those three main points that I talked at the beginning, I'm excited. So Dave, like you're in Chicago, but what brought you there? You've been at the same church for 30 years? How's community? Like tell us and tell me a little bit more of your story. And then you could include maybe Sue and your family a little bit, and like yeah, so tell us a bit about Dave before we get into what you do. Let's see who you are.
Yeah. And kind of our church planning story.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, basically, Sue and I had just gotten married. She claims that I didn't tell her we're going to plant a church until our honeymoon. Kind of like, it was like, she calls it bait and switch when she's giving me a hard time. I would say, no, you knew this is what we were doing. But basically, she kept teaching. So she was my biggest fundraiser. She kept teaching while myself and four other friends, basically out of college, we moved back to Chicago. And our first location was in the west suburb of Naperville, a town that I still live in. And so we started the church there. I was 25. My brother John was 23. We were all in our early mid 20s. It was not a what you'd call kind of a dream team by any stretch of the imagination. It was, but we were friends, and so we had a lot of fun, and God blessed it. And so if you fast forward, we planted there, and then about 9 or 10 years into it, we were one of the pioneers in kind of the multi-site. I had a couple friends who become Christians who are real estate developers, and they actually built a community center and let us be like a focus group, because it became the hub of our second location. And we didn't even know it then, but it was kind of like, oh, I guess we're this thing called MultiSide Church. And then we went on, and now we have 11 locations in the city and suburbs of Chicago, including 3 that are in prisons. So that's kind of it in a nutshell as far as what we're doing. And that really became kind of the hub for our church planning efforts initially through NewThing, which God has just blessed in amazing ways.
Yeah. And can you tell me a little bit more about NewThing and what NewThing is? I'll make sure that we share the website link as well. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was probably about 9 or 10 years into the life of community that my youth pastor came to me and said, hey, I want to do what you did. And I was like, what's that? And he said, plant a church. And this is, I know, Jason, we were kind of talking a little shop about church planting, and you're excited about church planting. This will ruin everything, because to be honest with you, I was like, oh, I don't want you to go plant a church. I want there was like somebody else on my team. We should send them, because I really like this guy. I want him to be like the youth pastor for my kids.
Mm-hmm.
But he had it, you could see it in his eyes. And I said, well, where? And he was thinking about somewhere out in Colorado. So I said, well, why don't you go out there and check it out? Go out there and check it out for a week, come back, then we'll talk about it. He takes a couple people with him. They come back, and I said, how'd it go? And I won't even tell you the amount, but in about a week and a half, he had raised enough money. I mean, he'd raised a ton of money, and it was clear that God was behind this. Mm-hmm. So I got on board with it, and we got him and his wife up in front of all of our leaders, and we said, hey, if they're supposed to go out there and plant this church, it's clear God's behind it. Some of you need to go with them. And we had about 35 folks that moved from Chicago out to Colorado, sold their homes, got new jobs, transferred schools, and that became our first church plant. And then the next year, we did Southern California. The next year was New York, then Boston, then outside of Detroit, then Knoxville. And we would all just kind of get together because we liked each other, and we were sharing resources. And so then we said, hey, I think we have a network. And we started calling it NewThing. But then it got to a place where it was like, all of a sudden there was like 12 of us, 12 church plants. And I wasn't able to, and I was trying to still kind of pastor like all of them, meet with them. And I couldn't meet with all of them. So then I said, well, what if instead of just reproducing churches, we start reproducing networks of these churches? And so I just asked two guys to be network leaders. We're making stuff up, right?
Yeah.
And, if you fast forward, what we discovered then is that these networks were really crucial for multiplying and reproducing more churches. And we're in a place now where we've helped plant a little over 5,000 churches, and we have about 500 networks around the world. And I mean, that thing has just totally surprised me and pleasantly, and God's been very, 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 very kind. So that's NewThing.
That's incredible. And my question, I was going to ask if it's outside of the continental US or if it's extended globally, but yeah, I saw.
As you can see, I mean, at first it was like, it's definitely just domestic, but now, I mean, like 2 weeks ago, I'm on this call with our partners in central India. And I mean, they know how to plant churches like crazy there. Literally, and I'm not making this up, but literally they had 6,000 leadership residents on this call that had gone through all their church planting training, and all of them had either planted a church or now getting ready to plant a church. Yeah. And they had 13,000 people in the pipeline. I mean, it's insane kind of stuff for us in the West. So they asked me to give a little talk to kind of commission them, tell them go. But I mean, some of the stuff we're going to do globally is just
what do you say when, I mean, God's already obviously moving, and you jump in to encourage them, and you're like, you should probably just keep doing what you're doing. I feel like
seriously, I mean, it's kind of like, Dave, just don't screw up the good stuff that God's doing. That's
yeah. That's interesting that you went there, and I saw a question already that someone had asked about church planting in Southeast Asia, for example. I don't know if there's anything that you could speak to before we move on that subject matter, but I mean, do you see the church growing globally, and then any pulse on Southeast Asia? Is there anything you can speak to there?
The partners that we have there and the networks that we're working there, most of them are doing are much more what we would call as micro churches here. And and it's not a typical kind of Western, and I'll use some church planning terminology, a launch large kind of approach. So oftentimes it's led by someone who's not paid, and it could meet, where you live, work, or play. And it might be anywhere from, 15 to 50 people. And that person pastors those people, disciples those people, but then also, more as important also, is developing other people going to start other churches. So the ones that we're seeing that are growing quite rapidly there, that's usually the form. And the other thing I'll add on this too is, in those parts of the world, I would say they seem to be doing a much better job than we are at actually disciple making and disciple multiplying. And so we're really trying to, I think there's some things in the West that we understand about leadership, we're able to help them with. But in that part of the world, we're really learning from them. Okay, how do you make and multiply like disciples? So in some ways, I'm really not giving any tips for church planting in Southeast Asia. It's more like I'm observing what I'm seeing our people do and saying, yeah, that's working. And in fact, I think it's a good tip for us here in the West.
Yeah. Or at the same time, maybe you just kind of did a passive tip in that leadership. Some things could be learned or collaborated or shared back and forth as far as how we do things and how they do things. That's
absolutely. One of the real gifts for me being a part of NewThing, now that we're in almost 50 countries, is you get to see the global body of Christ. And like the way the Africans do evangelism, or the way, in some ways, the way they worship in South America, or like I already mentioned, leadership, in the Western world, like North America. It's like each part of the body of Christ really has something unique to contribute. And probably one of the things I think, particularly for us as Western leaders, is we need to have the humility to say, okay, yeah, we do have some things we can contribute, but there's a whole lot we can learn, because the center of Christianity is no longer, it's not in Europe, it's not in the United States. It's probably somewhere in Africa or in some other part of, Asia, but that's where it's growing the fastest.
Yeah. Do you feel that there's a reason, or there's something keeping the humility? You just said we've got to have the humility to look outside of our own context and outside of what we're doing here. And do you think that I want to think that there's something about culture, or there's something that's like pushing us as leaders, as church leaders, to lean into. I feel like there are walls up when you talk about worship and discipleship. There are some things that like, if we just let ourselves relax a little bit and look globally, then we could learn a lot. And I just feel like there may be pride, or there may be something within. I don't want to put certain churches put certain communities in a box, but I feel like there's some things that need broken down, is kind of what I feel like. And so I was wondering if there's anything specific that you'd speak to.
No, I agree with you 100%. And in fact, I mean, within NewThing, we're getting ready to release something called our movement system. We're beta testing it now, and it's a whole training cohort about reproducing this. And then there's one on reproducing leaders, reproducing churches, and then reproducing networks. Mm-hmm. But the one on reproducing disciples, most of the content that we have in that one comes from the States. Because as we look at the United States, we're going like, let's be honest, we're just not as good at that yet.
Yeah. And why aren't we, is what I'm asking. So
I think, I mean, there's a lot of speculation about that. I think part of it is because I don't think the motivation was bad, because of, I would say two things. In church planning world, the launch large strategy, which did on trying to gather a large group of other people in one place, which is kind of also been informed by church growth movement, which in itself is not bad. Growing churches is not bad. But when the sole goal becomes to kind of have, butts in the seats, that is not disciple making. And I think when you build, let's say you build an auditorium that has 400 seats, or you have 1,000 seats, or however big it is, the motivation of the institution is to fill that room. And quite frankly, the ego of the pastor is also on the line to fill that room. And so you got all those things just about filling the room. Sometimes those do compete against making disciples. And I think for us in the West. Yeah.
Filling it with individuals and not filling it with disciples. And
just filling it.
Yeah.
Just because I mean, that's what we count. Like, we don't count how many disciples, we count how many people showed up on Sunday. And so if I have 500 seats and 500 people showed up, woohoo, that's a win. Well, is it a win? So, I mean, I think it's a little bit about our scorecard, our metric. I mean, what do we keeping track of, and we need some different. Okay, how do we actually keep track of? Are we making disciples and multiplying disciples?
Right. So that's great. And there's like only so much time. I want to make sure I get to Exponential, and I want to make sure I get to church planting for sure, on the other side of encouragement. So thank you so much, Dave. That was great. I feel like I could refill my coffee cup and just talk with you about global church for the longest time. So what is
We could let those
Exponential?
people go, and me and you can hang out afterwards.
True, I'm here. So Exponential is another initiative. So you're a pastor, you're running with NewThing, and then Exponential. A lot of folks know it for conferences, but what's the elevator pitch or a sentence about Exponential? And then what problem are you trying to solve, and what solution does Exponential offer?
Love it. Great question. They did the homework on church planning, and they know this, that brand new churches will see 3 to 4 times as many conversions as do established churches 10 years of age or older. So again, brand new churches, church planning, will see 3 to 4 times as many conversions as do churches 10 years of age or older. So essentially, if we're serious about the Great Commission, if we're serious about the Jesus mission, as I call it, okay, then we have to be serious about church planting. And so Exponential is all about helping leaders and churches learn to multiply at every level. How do you multiply disciples? How do you multiply leaders? How do you multiply churches? And even how do you multiply networks? And our vision at Exponential is what we call the 16% mission. Because what we want to see is we would like to see 16% of the churches in the United States either be what we would call reproducing or multiplying churches. And reproducing is you've planted at least one church or one site, or multiplying churches, you've done it for generations now. And you talked about, a church, I think you kind of still consider your home church, where they were planting 2 churches. We were talking about this before everybody else got on. 2 churches every year, which is awesome. So that would be like a level 5. We call it a level 5 church, but enough of the nomenclature. But basically the mission is 16%. If we can get 16%, that's kind of like a sociological Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point. And we feel like if 16% of churches were reproducing or multiplying, and that was happening, because then again, remember, 3 to 4 times as many conversions, we believe that can change the spiritual landscape of North America. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of, you might say that's the hill we're dying on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so could you speak to a few resources that you offer church leaders? And I know that I just mentioned conferences. So
yeah, we would love to have everybody come to our conference. We have a global conference down in Orlando that sells out every year. 5 main sessions with some of the best speakers on the planet talking about multiplication and church planning, plus about 150 different workshops. If you can't make it to Orlando, though, we have regionals. We have 7 different regionals. In fact, we got 4 this fall coming up in, let me see if I can remember, DC, Houston, Chicago, and Southern California. And we try to keep it super cheap because we know that a lot of people passionate about church planning aren't making big bucks. So I think right now, if they register before Saturday or Sunday, we have the best rate. I think it's like $79 or $69 for a whole group. So if you bring 25 or more, give them my email. I'll give them an even better deal.
All right.
The regionals are really awesome too. I mean, they're same content but closer to home, and it's more accessible for your team.
Yeah. And like I mentioned before, I went to Orlando. It was amazing. I mean, like, it's so encouraging. I feel like one of the things that you didn't mention about the conferences is just the community around all the leaders and sharing contacts and just sharing helpful personal stories of encouragement too. And it was real. I mean, it was just like a bunch of pastors who have just gone through and are navigating the pandemic, right, and then joining together and hanging out together and learning from experts. And so, yeah, that was great.
I think it's good that you said that, because one of the things at the beginning of every conference, I will always say this, because I think this is true. I will tell people, Exponential is not so much a conference as it is a community with a cause.
Yeah.
And what you felt is something that we've seen develop over the years, that people just kind of come and hang out. And like my wife, actually, it was fun this year. My wife, because we didn't get to go last year or the year before because of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And Sue would say this. She's like, yeah, those are my people.
That's cool.
You're there. And what's cool about it is, I mean, you got people from every denomination.
Yeah.
You got people, I mean, different kind of theological streams. They're there because they all love Jesus, and they're all wanting to advance the mission through multiplying disciples, leaders, churches, and networks.
Yeah. On the note of pandemic and your own ministry, I wanted to make sure I ask you about just, like I said, it's not really over. Just kind of again, the pulse of the church, I guess, in the pandemic or the post-pandemic or the transitioning from pandemic world or what have you. I got to listen. I was listening to an interview, Carey Nieuwhof, and you were speaking with him, and he said, describe how you're feeling as a pastor at Community in this world. And you said, I have two words: it's challenging and it's invigorating. And so you were talking about how much of a challenge and how much of a grind it was, but at the same time, how much it was doing ministry with kind of like a renewed purpose, and almost like it's been a while since you got to plant Community. And so how about from your own seat, how have you, where are you at with the pandemic, I guess, and how do you feel? And then the same as the church, do you feel a lot of pains there still with Exponential?
Wow, great. Lots of questions there. Great. I would still say those two words of both challenging and invigorating describe it. Invigorating because I am, at the way God's wired me, I'm an entrepreneur. And when you've been in a church for 30 years, it's kind of like all of a sudden what it did, it gave me permission to change anything I wanted. Mm-hmm. In fact, I tell other church leaders that, hey, if there's anything you ever wanted to change, do it now. And you just blame COVID. It's COVID's fault we had to do it. And so that part,
yeah,
actually, I mean, because the kind of stuff we're going to do digitally is, I mean, we leapfrog way ahead, which is awesome. We're also experimenting with micro churches. So we have about a half dozen micro churches we've helped start. But then along the way, we had a guy, this is a funny story, a guy from, again, India, here we go, who started attending online. And then he asked, hey, can I go through the micro church training? He goes through the micro church training, our stuff. And he's like, can I start one of your 3C communities? We're like, of course you can. So we commissioned him. He starts it. Not only does he start it, but then he ends up starting, actually train other people. And now we have 4 micro churches in Chicago, but we have 16 in India. And we just got an email from the guy, and he's got 50 people that want to get baptized. So It's like, I mean, so that is invigorating.
Yeah.
The challenging part is I also feel like COVID has, and I don't think this will be news to anybody, it has dramatically polarized us culturally in ways I think unlike any time in my lifetime. And so it feels like it's almost like every week there's a different issue that that people want to fight about, and playing referee, trying to get people to understand, what, the political right does not have the answers. The political left does not have the answers. Jesus has the answer. And how do you get people to take their eyes, off of MSNBC and Fox News and focus on Jesus? Mm-hmm. That's the challenging part. And when those networks are running 24/7 on all the platforms, and you're trying to get a few hours a week, it's with your airtime, that becomes very, very, very challenging. So that's the challenging part of being a pastor for all of us these days. But in the middle of it, I think the new forms of church and the things that are going to reach people are being invented right now. And we'll know about it in 5, 10, 15 years from now. And I'm excited about that. And that's invigorating. But keeping it real, it's challenging. That's why you got 42% of pastors saying, hey, I'm thinking about quitting.
Yeah. That's what I haven't heard the stat, but I have heard just tired pastors. And so, yeah.
No, I think Christianity Today did the homework on it, and that I just saw it in their latest issue, and Carey Nieuwhof's been talking about it as well.
Okay. And innovating is the word that came to mind while you were talking to that. I feel like the church has had to innovate in so many
Yep.
different ways, whether it's going online fully or what a hybrid model looks like, or those kinds of questions. What do you think if you dream? I saw a question about this. I don't know if you were able to see that, Dave, but the 5 or 10 years, there's talk of meta churches and Oculus glasses where we're meeting in communities online, and there's virtual baptisms and etc. I mean, do you have any idea of where things may be headed with balancing digital and then in person?
Well, again, of course, I don't know, but I can make something up.
Yeah.
um, I think like what you're talking about with digital churches, like and churches in the metaverse, VR church. I mean, that's not something for the future. That is happening right now.
Mm,
We actually, so within NewThing, we talked about 9 different regions of the world. In the last year, we added what we called it, because we broke up the whole world in 9 different locales. We actually added a 10th one, and it's our digital region.
yeah.
And Jeff Reed is leading that for us. And within about three months, he had 70 churches in 12 networks, church planting networks, all digital churches formed. And this is the only time in the history of NewThing where I went to him. I said, you know what, Jeff, I think you need to slow this down, because I like things that grow, and I like movement up and to the right. And I said, I think you need to slow this down, because you need to make sure these networks are actually planting other digital churches or operationalizing it. So
Hmm.
it's very much happening.
Yeah.
And in fact, a part of July, I'm spending just trying to do more and more homework on that, so I'm better versed in it. But I got my own Oculus, um, and checking it out. And I would encourage. I mean, if you can afford them, get yourself a pair. If you can't, borrow somebody's. But to
Hmm.
be informed, because it's the key question I think people are going to have to wrestle with. And we may not have time for this one, Jason, but what is your minimal ecclesiology? And by that I mean, what do you actually? What what would you consider a church? The least thing that you consider a church, and
Yeah.
that'll impact, I think, a lot. Um, both expressions, I think, that are going to be key to the future: digital expressions and also micro expressions.
Hmm. Yeah. And it made me think of, again, I mean, who knows where the topic will go with your upcoming webinar, but the topic of that webinar, as it stands, is really making the most of the church in your own footprint, equipping, mobilizing the church for evangelism in the digital age. And so if it's an online campus only, online only campus, which a lot of churches have gone
Yeah,
that route. If it's branching out and starting a new campus, which is online only, or if it's something as far as Twitch or Oculus or
yeah.
whatever, what have you, then that may be something that would interest folks. And so that webinar came to mind again. Or if you're just interested in watching Dave fumble through learning Logos Bible software, that webinar that webinar is for you.
There's
So
there's something ironic about pretending like I am an expert on digital churches, but somehow I can't maneuver the Logos Bible software. I don't know what's going on here.
no, I think you can't be a master of everything, Dave. So then the last thing that I really want to camp out on is encouragement. And you've already shared a few stories that are just like amazing. I mean, it's so cool to hear what the church is doing globally. It's also great to hear even what's happening across the nation. And so, um, first question would be books or podcasts or some resources to equip leaders. Do you have any that come to mind right away? Anything that you'd suggest for church leaders?
Um, I I would encourage people to go to exponential.org. We have a ton of free resources there, and kind of keeping it real. When we first started offering free resources, free ebooks, some of the content was just okay, and some of it was mine. But I'll tell you what, the quality of content now that we are giving away to people, it is outstanding stuff. So if you're interested in this conversation around multiplying disciples, leaders,
Mhm.
churches, networks, go check it out. Basically, if you give us your email, we'll give you all kinds of stuff, and that's kind of the trade. And it's great content. People might want to check out. I think I wrote a book right before Bless. I wrote a book called Hero Maker. It was our
Mhm.
theme for Exponential one year. I think that would be a great resource for people. It's kind of the 5 practices of leaders that multiply leaders. He gives a lot of the kind of exponential speak and nomenclature and kind of, I briefly referred to what it means to be a level 4, level 5 church. We talk about that in there. That would be a helpful resource to them.
Great. Cool. And then what about, you mentioned at the front end, I think it was RPMS, right?
Yeah.
Or any practical steps for leaders to balance all that they're balancing. I mean, if they're looking at making decisions of going online, they're also visiting someone in the hospital, they're preparing for a sermon coming up, and so they're balancing a lot. You have your own practical advice. Is there anything else you'd share?
Here's what I do. And this is my journal. And so almost every day I try to journal. And this is literally about a 3-minute exercise that I think can keep you from drifting. My working theory is most leaders don't intentionally end up, 50 pounds overweight. Most leaders don't intentionally say, you know what, I want to have an affair and ruin my marriage. Most leaders don't intentionally kind of say, you know what, I want to work so hard that I have I'm burnout and have a mental breakdown. We just kind of drift one day at a time. So what I try to do is if you can see this or not, but this is RPMS. And this kind of is along the same lines as Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, and favor with God and man. So it's relational, physical, mental, and spiritual. And what I do is I ask myself, okay, how you doing relationally today? And that's kind of like, how's your marriage? How's your relationship with your kids? Friendships, are you cultivating friendships? And I give myself a number on a scale of 1 to 10. And then this is where it gets a little neurotic. Kind of like the stock, give myself an arrow if it's going up from the day before, or an arrow down if it's going
how you're trending.
Exactly how I'm trending, or
Yeah.
a dot stayed the same. And so you can see like this is a 6.2. So actually I'm trending up relationally. Physically, I give myself a number then. And for me, my primary mode of exercise is run. I'm a runner. I like to run. So that's it. And then mentally, it's kind of interesting. When I first started doing this mentally, it was more about learning. This is like 10 years ago. I was kind of like more, am I learning new things? Now it's much more about how's my mental health? Because I think we've all been through so much. And then the last one is spiritual. How's the relationship with me and God? And then I give myself a total score here is all right. Relational, physical, mental, and spiritual. And literally, if you just do this on your journal, or even just sit down on your laptop or your iPad, whatever, if you'll just take 3 minutes to do this every day, I think, again, this is not going to be the cure-all, but what it does, it makes me tell the truth about myself so that, you know what, if I end up 50 pounds overweight, it's kind of like one day at a time, I go like, you know what, no, physically you're not doing the right stuff. You're not doing it. Or relationally, or spiritually. It makes me tell the truth about myself. And that has been a big, big help to me.
Right. Yeah. It makes me think of putting an oxygen mask on before you go and help others. You're just sitting there and taking the time to make sure that you have your ducks in a row. And if something's out of whack, then they can be adjusted. And you do that before you run out the door and help others. But yeah, I think that's
I'm
great.
thinking maybe that, I don't know if there's enough there or not, but I have thought about that being a book and kind of like, how do you lead yourself?
Yeah.
Because before you lead other people, like, how do you lead yourself? So we'll see.
Yeah. So I want to close in really, it'd be cool if there's anything from Scripture or from any churches that you've had consulting with, that you've worked with. You obviously don't have to say specific names. If there's any practical examples from stories, including the Bible, that you may want to leave with church leaders, that would be a piece of encouragement as we start to wrap things up here.
What does come to mind? It was interesting. You know Ed Stetzer?
I do. Yeah.
Okay, so Ed came and spoke at one of our NewThing gatherings recently in Chicago, and he made this observation, this was encouraging to me. So I'll kind of pass this along. He talked about every 60 years, there's what he called a cultural convulsion, and he's what we're going through and have gone through the last couple of years. Most people we say, oh, it's unprecedented, and there are that are definitely traumatic. I don't want to downplay that. But Ed made the point. He said, in some ways, we went through a lot of the same things in the 60s. And he talked about the assassination of JFK, and then also RFK, and then also MLK. He talked about the Vietnam War. He talked about, go back and watch the video if you can find it too. The shooting at Kent State. I mean, shooting college kids. The riots in Chicago during the Democratic National Convention. It was a crazy time. So he says about every 60 years has happened. He said, but the good news is in the middle of these cultural convulsions, though, it's also a time that's ripe for movement. And he said, because it was out of the 60s then that we actually gave birth to the Jesus people. And the Jesus people also Calvary Chapel, which was probably in some ways our most recent church planting movement in North America. Also, that gave birth to, there was a guy named John Wimber, who was a part of the Righteous Brothers band, who becomes a Christian, by just reading the Bible. And fascinating story. He walks into the church for the first time, a mainline kind of church. And after sitting through the whole service, he walks back to the pastor and he says, "Hey, when did the pastor says, what stuff?" He says, "The stuff in the Bible, the miracles, that stuff." And then he goes ahead and, starts a vineyard church where they believe that God still does miracles. But then that ended up being a whole movement of church planting too. And basically Ed's point was, during these times of cultural convulsion, as hard as it is, as challenging as it is, dramatic as it is for us, he says those are also times that are ripe for movement. And so I just want to encourage church leaders. I know it's hard. I am one, and it is hard. It is hard. It's hard as it's ever been, pastor. But what we're doing right now, I do believe this, is I think we are laying the foundation and inventing the ways that I think the church of the future, particularly here in the United States and the West, is going to be. And that's just an exciting opportunity.
Yeah. Did you say culture convulsion?
I think that's what he called it, a cultural convulsion. Yeah.
Convulsion. That's great. Yeah. Thanks, Dave. And thanks for just the global perspective and reminder. I mean, it is sometimes we have blinders, and it's so encouraging to have that conversation about what's happening around the world. So that was great as well.
Make no mistake, God is at work.
Yeah. So I think we're about at time here. I want to close, and anybody who's tuning in and watching part of this conversation here, I want to make sure that I let you know that we've got some exciting interviews coming up as well. And so we've got IVP next week. We'll be talking to them about their 75th anniversary. And so we'll be talking about Christian publishing and what's happened there in that space. Michael Bird, Beth Moore, we have some really exciting interviews headed our way. And so if you check out logos.com/live, information will be there. But really just thanks, Dave, for being here with us today and for talking to us about church planting. And then we look forward to the upcoming webinar in September. I know I do, for sure. I'll be watching for a few different reasons. So thank you so much, Dave. I appreciate your time.